Hello fellow leather crafters from across the globe, Serge Vulcan here, and today in this episode we really are going to, I don't want to say dye, let's say color leather, but we're going to use leather dye. And let's start easy and just like use one color and see all the things we can explore just with that one color. You'll see it's going to be quite interesting. I bet you don't even know how dye works, do you? The first component would be the solvent. It can be alcohol, spirits, or water, or any other type of solvent. Then there is the pigment. It's a really fine colored dust that is suspended within this liquid solvent. We could consider the solvent as a means of transportation for the pigment that is brought to the surface and underneath the surface of our leather. The solvent slowly evaporates, and once the solvent is gone, all that remains is the pigment on the surface and under the surface of the leather. If you ever wondered how they would color leather in the ancient times, well, we know very little from the antiquity, just a mention of one or two ingredients, but no recipe or instructions of how to do it. Same goes for the Middle Ages. Then we start getting textbooks from the 18th century. Sounds a little bit like alchemy, and the products they mention probably don't have the same name and are hard to find. And we only start to get some serious literature about it from the 19th century. Some professional books like the destined for people who work in the field, the professionals. But if I go through the ingredients, it's mainly they use acids, phthalic acids, and you name it. And that doesn't change much. At the beginning of the 20th century, Georges de Récy also mentions acids and stuff. And all the way up into 1933, a book, L'Art du Cuir, again, French source. Boy, I'm so happy to speak more than just one language, right? So let's see what they have a little bit as ingredients. And all right, so if you want to get some, let me change eyes. It's nice when you get older, you get 3 sets of eyes. The ones you're born with plus the 2 other ones. Iron chloride. Yeah, that one is nice. It gives you some nice gray tones, can go all the way up to black. But iron chloride is actually highly corrosive. It's quite harmful. It can chew a hole through your hand. Iron sulfate, a little less dangerous. People can make it themselves in their kitchen with the so-called vinegaroon. Some of you may have heard about it, but we'll talk about that in another chapter. Sodium hydroxide, brown tones. Again, some stuff that burns through your skin. I mean, you can look these terms up on Wikipedia, for example, sodium hydroxide. And another one, oh, this is the best one, picric acid. It's actually also known as trinitrophenol or PNP. That stuff is supposed to be stored in water, if it's in the pure form, of course. It's shock sensitive, and basically, if you want to get rid of that stuff, you better call bomb disposal. I highly doubt you can get a hand on that stuff, huh? What else do we have? Hydrochloric acid. Yeah, very corrosive. Also burns through your leather, your hand, and probably takes a leg on its way out. Well, roughly speaking, let's better rely on the products that are sold on the market and that already obey some safety regulations. Health regulation theory, blah, 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 blah. Come on, enough of that theory. We want to see some hands-on. Alright then, let's start. We have here some uncolored vegetable tanned leather blanks. First, we'll talk about applicator. Using a paintbrush can leave streaks if used like this. So if using a brush for smaller surfaces, spread the dye in small circular motions and eventually run your brush a second time over it. The more dye you can charge on your applicator, the more regular you can apply a dye. The Q-tip certainly isn't optimal. It runs out of dye too quickly. Much better already is the use of a wool dauber that can take quite a good load of dye stuff and can be worked into the surface. For larger surfaces, you're better off using a piece of sheepskin. You'd be amazed how much dye that can carry. My next experiment is concerned with how well does the leather take dye if it's humid or wet. I'll use my sheepskin for the bottom half of my test piece. I'll do the top half with a dauber just to see if there really is a difference. There's only one way to find out, and it's to test it. It already shows that the wet part is darker, but it isn't dry yet, so I'll take my chance and just buff the middle section up briskly. And while I buff it, I already can see that it starts to get a little shine in the middle. It looks pretty and glossy. But we'll have to give it some time to dry to see if there really is a difference once everything's set. And 3 hours later, I can see there really is. We can see 4 different shades of brown just from this one bottle of dye. Nicely chocolatey brown on the wet part, kind of glossy and reddish towards the middle where I buffed it up, and then the Spanish brown tan to the left side. Meanwhile, my first piece had plenty of time to dry, so I can buff as much as I want. It's not going to change. So I'm trying to find out if I just wet it a little bit with the sponge, will it do the same buffing effect as with the dye that hasn't totally dried out? Again, only one way to find out, and that is to try it out. And let's buff again. Buff, 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 buff. Don't use too much pressure. Go lightly over it, but regularly. And yeah, it seems to work, just as if the dye would still be kind of fresh and humid. And look at this. It works just perfect. Now remember, this piece was only dyed in a dry state, and we already see different colors due to the applicators and the quantity of dye we got into the leather. Plus, the buffed up part has got this really nice antique leather vintage look. Isn't that nice? Just with one color. Spanish brown oil dye. Great stuff. You see, I wasn't promising too much when I said that there is a diversity that you can get out just of one bottle of dye. In my case, I used oil dye. They renamed it now to Pro Dye because the name is kind of confusing. There is no oil involved. It's alcohol-based dye. The only difference to leather dye is that in Pro Dye, or what they called oil dye, there is a greasy or oily pigment that was used, hence the name oil dye. But now the new branding is called Pro Dye with the Phoebings products. I also tested it with water-based leather color and came doing the same experiments to the same results. Just the buffing alone. Look at the gloss I get out of it with the water-based dye or the ordinary dye. Besides, using water-based dye may help to have a more regular application of color because it doesn't penetrate as fast, so you have to really work your dye in and get a little more regular shape. Hand coloring leather always has its surprises, as we've seen the difference between the leather, how it was tanned, the humidity, how it was applied, etc. There's always a surprise factor to it. And there might be some irregularities, like little shades, little cloudiness, or wrinkles that take a little more color. It's never 100% even. If you want 100% even color, then better just buy it colored and don't even try. But the beauty of hand-colored leather, it's actually all this little finesse of irregularities that makes the beauty of it. Okay, so hand coloring leather, it's art. It's not science. Depending whether your leather is dry or wet, Whether you use a paintbrush, a dauber, piece of rag, or piece of dead sheep, we still haven't heard a single word about this one.